Hi, welcome. My name is Jennifer Ponce de León. I am the Associate Director of the Critical Theory Workshop, and we are here today to celebrate the publication of John Bellamy Foster's new book, The Dialectics of Ecology, Socialism and Nature, which was recently published by Monthly Review Press. And this event is also co-sponsored by Monthly Review. I will keep my introductory comments very brief as we have four speakers today. In addition to John Bellamy Foster, we will also be hearing from Elizabeth Miller, Brian Napolitano, and Gabriel Rockhill. So John will first speak about the book, followed by the responses. Then John will respond to those. And then if we have time, we'll open up for questions. So for many of you watching or seeing this video, John Bellamy Foster needs no introduction. He is an intellectual giant, an unbelievably rigorous scholar, and a crucially important pole of clarity and integrity within the US left. He has written widely on political economy and is internationally celebrated as a major environmental sociologist. He is professor of sociology at the University of Oregon and the editor of Monthly Review, the US's longest running and most important socialist publication. In addition to the Dialectics of Ecology, John is the author of many, many books. These include The Return of Nature, which won the Deutscher Memorial Prize, The Robbery of Nature, written with Brett Clark, Marx's Ecology, Materialism and Nature, The Great Financial Crisis, Causes and Consequences, written with Fred Magdoff, The Ecological Rift, authored with Brett Clark and Richard York, and The Theory of Monopoly Capitalism, an elaboration of Marxian political economy, among many others. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I'm honored to be part of the Critical Theory Workshop presentations, and especially honored that this focuses on my book, The Dialectics of Ecology. Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, in their Dialectical Biologist, referred to our world as the alienated world. And of course, that came mainly from Marx. And what they meant was that our world is alienated because we have alienated labor. That is, labor is alienated in our society, and alienated nature. We've alienated nature from human society. And this produces an alienated consciousness and what we might call alienated bourgeois or liberal consciousness, in which the frameworks for thought are primarily determined by idealism, dualism, reductionism, etc., that forms of thought that fragment or invert the fundamental relations of the material world and human relations to the material world. And this is a very serious problem because we live in the alienated world, so alienated that we now have a planetary ecological crisis. We're essentially destroying the conditions of human existence on the planet. And this is not an opinion. This is the global scientific consensus. And the planetary ecological crisis, of which climate change is only one part, raises for us the question of the Earth system in science terms, but it raises more fundamentally the problem of totality, the problem of how do we see the world existence, the human relation to the world as a whole. And in looking at totality, we need to turn to Marx and to some extent Hegel, but Marx provides probably the most unified analysis of totality in all its aspects that we have as a basis for understanding and method. And if we think of Hegel, famously said, the truth is the whole. And that's often quoted, but if you read the other part of the passage or the remainder of the sentence, he says essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, then it can only be understood in terms of its becoming. And this, in order to understand totality, we have to understand it, how it's mediated. And we can only understand that in historical terms and in material terms. So we have to understand it genetically. But Hegel and Marx both referred to genetic exposition, that is, looking for the origins of things and their development, their becoming, their historical manifestations as the key to understanding the world as a whole. Now, within Marxism itself, we have a problem of fragmentation. And this is a problem of fragmentation that resembles many of the problems within liberal or bourgeois thought itself. So we have a situation in which materialism has been removed from dialectics. Materialism has often been removed from Marxism, at least materialism in the ontological sense, having to do with material reality, the nature of being, as opposed to just economics. And dialectics has been removed from Marxism in the sense that the dialectics of nature has been excluded, so that the whole notion, which both Marx and Engels presented of a dialectics that applied to the entire natural world, which is totality, of course, material totality. Human society is an emergent form within the totality of nature, and yet the dialectics of nature was abandoned by Western Marxism, and in a different way by Soviet Marxism, beginning with Stalin. So many aspects of Marxian dialectics got excluded, including the ability to deal with the material world in its entirety. That whole realm of the dialectics of nature, most famously associated with Engels, was excluded from Marxism within the entire Western Marxist philosophical tradition in particular. And the result was that Marxism had very little to say about science or Western Marxist philosophy. There was still a Marxist tradition within science, but that often got ignored. So you have a situation where Marxism became distant from science and also distant from materialism in the full sense. Materialism became simply economic relations or means of production, and the whole idea of human beings as corporeal beings, as material beings, as part of material existence, which we now think of as ecological, got excluded from Marxism. So Marxism got fragmented in this way. It got fragmented in other related ways. Engels got excluded from Marx. Engels was removed from Marx. Engels came to be associated with Marxism, and Marx was a pure thinker who had no relation to Marxism. So the interpretation has gone, and so Marx became removed from Marxism, from the entire Marxian tradition, outside of a very narrow spectrum of Western Marxist philosophy. And you have a situation where Marx is actually taken away from Marxism. Marx now belongs to philosophy independent of Marxism. But this is all part and parcel of the elimination of materialism from Marx, the removal of the dialectics of nature, and actually as well the removal of any kind of revolutionary perspective. So it becomes necessary to reconstruct Marx materialism and materialist dialectics. And for me, although I recognized this for a long time, it didn't become a pressing issue. It didn't become a pressing issue to try to reconstruct Marxism until I started addressing ecology. And then it became clear that that Marx's ecology derived from his fundamental materialist conception of nature, underlying the materialist conception of history, and that without an understanding of Marx's materialism, we couldn't understand Marxist ecology, and we couldn't really move forward on the ecological front. In fact, I concluded that Marx's ecology was derivative of his materialism, of his materialist conception of nature. So much so that if you dig into that, if you look at Marx's materialism, which I followed all the way back to his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and his relation to Epicurus, in a book that I now have coming out called Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Epicurus and Marx. But this was foreshadowed in the opening chapters of Marx's Ecology. Unless you go back to that fundamental materialism, you can't really understand what ecology was for Marx or how Marx managed to make the great advances in ecological thought that he did. In fact, it's his materialist conception of nature which pervades all of his works, but is what is often ignored. That is the real basis of his ecological perspective. This differs from a lot of thinkers, like Koei Saito focuses on Marx's earliest statements about ecological crisis, or what he thinks were the earliest statements about ecological crisis in Marx, which he says, began in the late 1850s or the 1860s. And it's true that that's when the metabolic rift analysis began to form, but that wasn't the beginning of Marx's ecological analysis. That actually goes back to the very foundations of his thought, and it is crucial in it's a part of his materialism and crucial to his entire analysis from the beginning. Even in terms of the ecological problem, you see Marx writing about it already in the economic and philosophical manuscripts. So the roots of Marx's ecological perspective is his materialism. But Marx's materialism is different than materialism as we often hear about it, or as often even perceive it. It isn't a mechanistic materialism or a reductionism. What we often we call mechanism now reductionism oftentimes. And so if you look at Levin and Lewontin's dialectical biologists, they're criticizing reductionism, but what they're criticizing is mechanism. And a mechanistic materialism, it's true that it employs some critical aspects and has been fundamental to the development of science. And it is in some ways at odds with idealism, but in some ways it also reinforces an idealist viewpoint, and it leads you into rigidities, into dualisms and reductionisms, notions like the mind is a secretion of the brain, which was a famous mechanistic statement. Marx and Engels would have none of that. Theirs was a materialism that was dialectical in nature. Engels called his work his great work, The Dialectics of Nature. So we can call their approach dialectical naturalism or dialectical materialism if we prefer. But the point is that they saw materialism as part of an overall dialectical approach, which applied to nature as well and dealt with the fundamental contradictions, contradictions, antinomies, the transcendence, sublation, the movement of material reality, and the agency behind it. They were very, theirs was a complex viewpoint that is based on movement and contradiction, transcendence, and emergence. And in fact, that kind of materialism, as Marx discovered, which was non-deterministic and consistent with notions of freedom and emergence, was already there in a kind of prefigured form in Epicurus, which stimulated much of his thought. So what I'm saying is that we have to, in order to deal with the ecological problem, and in order to deal with totality in the 21st century, we need to reconstruct Marxism. And the idea that the mature Marx can be separated from the early Marx is absurd. It's non-dialectical approach, which is always about genetic exposition. As Marx said, it's always about origins and development. And we have to approach Marx's thought and all analysis, all developments in that way. So we have to reconstruct Marx's thought, not just starting with the early Marx, with the economic philosophical manuscripts, but the very early Marx with Epicurus. Feuerbach got his materialism from Epicurus too, about the same time as Marx. And Marx approached it in a fundamentally deeper way. And what we get is a powerful ecological perspective. Now, in Western Marxism and also Eastern Marxism, there was a big division, as I said. Western Marxism threw out materialist ontology, and as part of that, they threw out the dialectics of nature. So there wasn't really very much left of the Marxian dialectic or Marxian materialism, but there was a lot to play around with, right? A lot of critical theory was possible, but removed from any kind of root materialism and any dialectics that would address materialism. And therefore, any kind of revolutionary conception of totality. And on the other hand, in the Soviet-type societies, they executed many of the ecologists. Some of the materialist dialectics that had been part of Lenin's thought and of the early Marxist thinkers in Russia and in the Soviet Union in the 1920s actually lasted in the corners of the system, but the destruction of any kind of true dialectical naturalism or dialectical materialism was pretty thoroughgoing. And the problem then with reconstructing Marx in this area and Marxism, it involves putting together these different traditions. And the thing is that they synthesized, reconstructed and synthesized and rooted in Marx, we have a whole analysis. Maybe Lukács, I think, is probably one of the greatest manifestations of that, and Henri Lefebvre. But we have to reconstruct what was alienated within Marxism itself. And without that, we can't deal with the ecological problem. And the book itself deals a lot with the financialization of nature, which is the the way in which the planetary crisis is being dealt with by the system, and it deals with a lot with the main responses. Marx's whole approach was one of sustainable human development, and the two main approaches that we have coming out of socialism in response to the ecological crisis now are ecological civilization in China, which really had its origins in the last years of the Soviet Union, but go back to the fundamentals of Marx, and they're constructing what is called an ecological civilization that is so fundamentally different than what exists in the West that the term ecological civilization is not used by any politician anywhere in the West, because the very idea of ecological civilization is too much a threat to capitalism. It is to talk about an ecological civilization is to talk about a non-capitalist civilization, and everyone knows that. The other approach is what we're calling planned degrowth. That is, there has been an emphasis on degrowth as a strategy, because some of the wealthiest, most imperialist countries are outreaching the limits of the planet. Well, the ecological footprint of the United States, if it was globalized, would require 4 planet Earths, and we simply can't do that. So we have to have some we need to move in a planned way that emphasizes reduction of waste and redistribution and use values and meeting people's essential needs and community and collective operations, everything that capitalism is against. I do not think, as I explain in the book, that degrowth can be made into an absolute principle. The absolute principle for Marxism is sustainable human development. That comes out of Marxist thought. Degrowth is not a principle any more than growth is an absolute principle. Rather, what we need to do is create a world of sustainable human development. And what we need is the reemergence, I say reemergence because it's existed before, of an environmental proletariat. Basically, working class movements, but in the very broadest sense, that doesn't exclude peasants and indigenous and so on, but and so many other elements that get excluded in the notion of the working class. Environmental proletariat means a proletariat that's as concerned about the environment, that the urban environment with clean water and clean air and human lifespans and dealing with epidemiological, that is, disease problems generated by capitalism, and all the rest, all of that and much more is the food availability, whether people have the food they need. All of that is as important or more important than simply struggles within, say, factories or within production itself. Historically, the socialist movement has connected life with production. We need to reconnect life and production, not treat them as separate entities. So that's basically the structure of this book and the analysis. I'm sorry if I went on a little too long here, but it's very schematic as it is.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, John. We'll now have some 3 responses. So we'll start first with Elizabeth Miller. Elizabeth is an ethnographer and Marxian labor scholar at the University of Arkansas, where she is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. Her scholarship examines the labor process and political materiality of chicken farming in the Southeast United States. While completing a manuscript on this project, she is also developing a new workplace ethnography focused on high-end service work in the global nightlife industry and producing and directing a feature-length documentary about the life and scholarship of John Bellamy Foster. We'll turn it now to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you, John, for putting this together and including me. I think my first comment is just the richness of the scholarship in this book and really the depth of historical evidence and also argumentation in the philosophical and other literatures that connect to this argument that you're building. It's very dense, and I think that when you're trying to make these kind of arguments that really like deconstruct a lot of tropes that people will have in kind of common conversation about why we can't have this as our reality and why this can't be our future. You really take them down very systematically and provide very clear reasons why that thinking is lacking in empiricism and so on. So I have quite a few notes. Let's see. So the first thing I wanted you to maybe speak more to that I found really interesting in the book was you talk in depth in quite a few places about agriculture, which you know is my interest. And so I was first wanted to ask, are there any organizations or practices, and you discuss these towards the end of the book, that you came across that are very revolutionary in their practice or their outcomes that you didn't have the space to write more about in the manuscript?
Do you want me to answer that now, or? Well, there's a whole huge movement of agroecology and taking various forms, and it's dynamic. That we know a lot. There are places where it's been applied more. Say in Cuba. Cuba is a leader in agroecology, and Mauricio Betancourt did a study for Global Environmental Change, one of the leading science journals, that showed that Cuba is able to do more with less, and to achieve the same outcomes with its agroecology, the same level of outcome as other Latin American states are able to achieve with high levels of chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides. So that's really important. We know a lot about our agroecology. We know that dealing with the soil metabolism is maybe maybe even the best way to that we have of dealing with climate change. And so there are all sorts of agroecological solutions to climate change. The best theorist of this that I know of, and the leading scientist on this is Fred Magdoff, who I've written with a lot and who has done books on this for Monthly Review Press, has brought together a lot of the agroecological work, written on soil metabolism and all of these things. And he's actually written a book he's written a book that explains how we could create an ecological society, and which I think is it is wonderful in its concreteness. We know what to do, and we know what to do in agriculture. The problem is agribusiness stands in the way, and agribusiness corporations, which are more and more concentrated and dominant. But there isn't a lack of understanding of improved ways that ecologically we could do much better. We know that, for example, that small farms are more efficient than large farms, than large agricultural production in terms of use of land. What the reason agribusiness emphasizes the large estates is because it's labor saving, and capitalism is all about profiting off of labor, and labor saving approaches the direction they go. But in ecological terms, it's actually less efficient, and smaller, more intensive agriculture with greater uses of human labor is actually a better route in terms of the planet. We can see that it's in various places in the world. So we have lots of answers and solutions. And as you know, we don't, and referring to your own research, we don't need to have, we don't need to have these chicken factories with everybody knows how abysmal it is. Doesn't have anything to do with sustainability or human welfare. It has to do with profits.
Great, thank you. And you wrote a book with Fred, right? For monthly review?
Yeah.
I enjoyed that. So
yeah.
A section in the book I found particularly horrifying was your discussion of ecosystem services and the creation of these markets on the stock exchange. I didn't realize the scope of it, and so I also wanted to ask you if you had more on that that you couldn't include in the book, or if things have changed that since the publication that you would add in or want to share with the audience.
Well, what Elizabeth is talking about is the part of the book that deals with the financialization of nature. The book starts with all these philosophical problems about how do we reconstruct Marxism in order to get back at totality, ecology, to think dialectically in relation to nature, to look at it materially. But then the proof is in the pudding. How do we then deal with the crucial problems, the ecological crisis that we're seeing? How do we use this kind of method to understand that and solutions? And since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the great financial crisis, capital has moved towards the financialization of nature. And there's a whole history of this within ecological economics, because Robert Costanza basically took over the journal Ecological Economics, which was more radical and more science-oriented in the beginning. And they started, his project was to put a price on everything in nature, right? Essentially develop a method for valuing nature. And they went ahead with that by turning all of nature into environmental services. That is, nature's only important to the extent that it provides environmental services to the capitalist world economy. So they divided all nature into environmental services and then started making up essentially values for it all on using various techniques based on the market. And so they came up with environmental services worth trillions of dollars and so on. And then that was taken over by corporations, essentially, who started using these same techniques to actually financialize nature, to bring nature within the market and the debt system. And this has become a very, very big enterprise, and it's supposed to save the environment. But if you look very closely at it, it's all about the expropriation of the environment, and not it's not about nature as use values. It's about nature as exchange value, and how we can then use it up. And they argue that this is going to save the environment because the market is the model of efficiency. So if we reduce nature to the market, then everything will be more efficient. But that's a fallacy, because even if you believe the market is efficient, it's only efficient in a narrow economic sense, not in an ecological sense, where it often represents death to the environment. So this is what I was trying to deal with in two articles on, and one of them really went into a case study, and then launched from there. And I went back into Marx's critique of this, his actual rejection of the concept of natural capital and so on. It's all part of his dialectical ecology. But in terms of further work, we are publishing a book with Month Review Press on the financialization of nature, by another author. I think it'll come out fairly soon. And there is more work on this. I can give you citations to things later on. Some of it is just in the citations in those chapters.
And is also in line with it being used by the state, like putting the dollar value on nature. That's also what the United States does in terms of policy, in like NEPA and having to do environmental impact statements. But I think we all know the state is captured by the capitalist class. So I also, in your remarks today, you mentioned several times this kind of removal of Marx from Marxism, and he's kind of tucked away in philosophy where his ecological critique can be comfortably ignored. How do we get past that today as critical theorists and the folks on the chat who might be more engaged in activism?
Well, I think this reconstruction of Marx's work after this and end of Marxism, after this long period of fragmentation, and which partly had to do with splits within Marxism itself, partly was splits between Marxism and mainstream thought. Partly, a lot of what, I guess you could say, a lot of what goes for Marxism nowadays is very liberal in its approach. And so it's a big battle. I was looking at the new Princeton University Press translation of Volume 1 of Capital that just came out last week. And I haven't been able to look over the whole translation, obviously, and I'm not by any means a judge of that, although I can see the consequences of the shifting around. There's no longer references in Volume 1 in the new translation to the robbery of nature, and its relation to the robbery of workers. It's just the stealing of nature, right? And I think, what are the consequences of these changes in vocabulary? And maybe they defend it as a more literal translation, but it also breaks, in some cases, the theoretical analysis that it runs through all of Marxist thought. But I was mainly looking at the introduction and preface, a foreword by Wendy Brown, And it's very clear if you look at the back of the book that almost there are no Marxist political economists endorsing the book, not even in political economists. Michael Heinrich, who's the great Marxist economist, was on the editorial board, but the book is packaged as a critical theory text, Marx's Capital, and so and this is being a more artistic translation. And then you have Wendy Brown in her forward, kind of says, well, it doesn't really matter if the labor theory of value is no longer relevant, and the Paul North's introduction does a similar sort of thing. So in Marx's great economic work that has had so much effect for so long, they're actually distancing themselves in the matter at the beginning of the book from his economics, and kind of emphasizing, well, he's mainly just important as a critical theorist now. And somehow, but these are people who are making judgments who aren't economists, don't know that part of the analysis, as opposed to the Penguin edition, which had the introduction by Ernest Mandel, who was a great Marxist economist. So you're having like Marxists being taken away from Marxism in various ways, and fragmented. And this is sort of an ongoing project. It has been going on for a long time, but I think it's more aggressive now that Marx can be perceived completely apart from Marxism. In this new edition of Capital, they don't bother to include Engels's prefaces to Capital. They're just dropped because Engels represents Marxism in this kind of critical theory view now. Well, Marx wasn't a Marxist. And so we have a lot to reconstruct. And I think the way to do it is to take on the biggest problems, take on totality, to go back to look at Marx's materialism, to look at his dialectics and his dialectical naturalism, and his conception of human freedom that have developed out of that. And our best way of dealing with our present problems and dealing with the fragmentation of Marx and Marxism is to reconstruct it all in terms of our times, not like a smorgasbord where we pick and choose, oh, we like this bit and we like that bit, but as a totality that has a value in itself.
Great, thank you. I'll wrap up this. I have more questions for you, but I really enjoyed also the chapter or the section when you talked about Taoism and Marx's engagement with that thinking, and you also discussed later on Xi Jinping and a comment. I don't know if he said this. It was from a Communist Party meeting. This quote you pulled out, the market is a force that is heartless and brainless. And I just wish that I would hear someone with political power in the United States say something so honest. What can we take from this work to kind of face this reality that they put so bluntly here, this heartless and brainlessness? What do you suggest?
Well, I guess it's hard to answer that because because it's such a core question that I'm almost speechless. I was thinking today about Engels's statement that capitalism is like a locomotive in which the driver is unable to free up the jammed safety valve. So the result is explosion and crash. And I think that why was that metaphor? I mean, you could read that now and you think, oh, well, that's an interesting metaphor. But what did he really mean? Well, in the 19th century, they had to, capitalism required a speed up, right? So the engineers, the drivers, were encouraged to jam the safety valves so that the boilers could heat up faster and more, and the train could go faster. The problem was that if they it heated up too much, the boiler would explode and the train would crash, and the people would die. And yet they did it all the time. He didn't even have to tell you in the quote that the drivers themselves were jamming the safety valves, and then they couldn't unjam them in time. But that's sort of like capitalism. It's sort of like, I mean, that seems heartless, right? You have a train full of passengers and you're jamming the safety valve because you wanted more speed because of profits. But how does that relate? That seems brainless too. It seems heartless. But how does that relate to, say, climate change or the planetary crisis we're having now? I mean, we're headed over the cliff. All of science is unified on that, and they're not doing anything. Why? Because the passengers on the train don't matter, right? And I think it's brainless and heartless, and we're headed towards destruction unless we develop some real alternatives, and that necessarily means going against the logic of capitalism, and is going to be a product of a movement towards socialism.
Great, thank you. I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and John. We'll move on now to Brian Napolitano. Brian is an assistant professor in the Centro de Investigaciones en Geografía Ambiental at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. His research is focused on spatial, temporal, and territorial dimensions of the metabolic rift and how they demand a radical socialist alternative rooted in substantive equality, autogestión, and concrete universality. He holds a doctorate in forestry and natural resources from Purdue University, and a master's in zoology, and a bachelor's in telecommunications from Michigan State. Brian, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop. John, thank you very much for elaborating on this outstanding work you've done and for continuing in this work. I personally have benefited greatly from it. It was it was about 15 years ago now that I was finishing my doctorate in forestry and natural resources, and first read the Ecological Revolution and said to myself, here is somebody who understands it. They understand the ecological, the scientific, the concepts of emergence, of evolution on the one hand, but also offers a viable explanation of why society is continuing in the way it is. That doesn't require appealing to things like humans being naturally greedy or destructive, or to having a couple bad characters in power. No, it describes it as a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. And this was something that I found that stood out to me in the Dialectics of Ecology, the way that this work continues on two important themes, one of which being obviously these ecological dialectics developed by Marx and Engels together, their material dialectical approach, rooted in the dialectics of nature, and on the other hand, really brings forward this concept of of the robbery of nature, brought out in the robbery of nature, of the way that capital works through a dialectical interplay of expropriation and exploitation, and how this is continuing within a worsening structural crisis of the global capitalist system that is giving us extreme, severe, potentially fatal, or inevitably fatal if they continue, manifestations of the metabolic rifts. And importantly, as this text makes clear, the intent here is not just to catalog this devastation or offer a sort of a hand-wringing or even an impartial account of the problems of contemporary capital accumulation, but to really clarify the perils and the possibilities of the historical juncture that we're standing in, and in the spirit of truly radical critique, to conceptualize the potential subjects capable of realizing these possibilities. And this is where these two significant potentially socialists movements emerge. The concept of ecological civilization that originates in the Soviet Union, but has become a cornerstone of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and the eco-socialist or planned degrowth, where this degrowth is planned, coordinated, and also aimed primarily at the overdeveloped economies of the North, which then allows for greater opportunities here in the global South to pursue alternatives to the dominant paradigm of social and economic development. And as Elizabeth also commented, one of the things that really stands out in this work is this idea of the financialization and the capitalization of nature. This to me is emblematic of the extraordinarily perverse logic according to which capital accumulation operates. I really like the way you portray this as effectively a protection racket being organized by the worst ecological offenders in the state and industrial and corporate sectors. One that's being organized within the global North and is aimed primarily at the global South, as well as the most excluded and politically marginalized segments of the North. I think laying out the way that this is capital's response, that this is entirely consistent with the logic of capital accumulation, and how this is how capital will continue to respond to what is a potentially fatal and extremely severe crisis in the conditions of social reproduction, really makes, to me, one of the strongest cases for the abolition of the capitalist system, for the establishment of a hegemonic socialist alternative. And what we see at what follows from this analysis, logically as well as chronologically, is these two movements, this ecological civilization and the degrowth movement, as bringing to the surface some of the latent contradictions of the process of transition, but also and activating some of the underlying contradictions, but also creating a potential point of rupture with the existing hegemony, with the existing system, and with the existing logic of accumulation. And again, this all goes back to this dialectical interconnection between the expropriation of nature, the exploitation of labor as the metabolic mediation between the social metabolism, the universal metabolism of nature, which in turn provides the pivot on which this concept of the environmental proletariat emerges as our potentially revolutionary subject, as well as establishing the necessities of substantive equality and ecological sustainability as the central pillars of the necessary hegemonic alternative, which then takes us, as you clearly pointed out, is extremely important, takes us to the issue of sustainable human development as the guiding principle of ecological society. And this brought me, reflecting on this, brought up a couple questions. I'll just sort of group them together, and then you can respond to them both as you see fit. one goes back to these two movements, this ecological civilization and degrowth, in terms of what are the opportunities or openings do you see for more overt, more explicit anti-imperial, anti-colonial struggles, and what's becoming increasingly or starting to emerge again, these concepts of delinking, or this move towards delinking. To some extent, they all these different concepts seem to implicitly entail breaking with the worldwide law of value, as Amin has pointed out, needs to be done. But also, I'm thinking in terms of an issue particularly relevant, given that Monday marks a full year of the escalation of Israeli genocide in Palestine and open aggression against Gaza. This issue of bringing together the struggles against colonialism and exterminism in the context of ecological civilization, in the context of planned degrowth. At one point, I recall hearing about a degree of cooperation in some of the encampments, I believe in the United States and the United Kingdom, between Palestinian movements and climate justice movements. And then in a very different context, but also important, Alan Mackey has repeatedly argued that that the environmental movement really needs to call attention to the ecological costs, the ecological footprints of militarism. And what all this points to is this sort of logical convergence between the struggle against exterminism and the struggle for ecological survival, going back to a point that you made in Socialism and Ecological Survival regarding the initial foundations of the ecological revolt being the peace movement and the environmental movements. It seems like these could come back together, but also in the context of a struggle against exterminism. So, what sort of possibilities do you see here? What would you see as the next steps to take, and how could we move forward and realize these possibilities, particularly as the capitalization and financialization of nature rooted in the global south is going to exacerbate an already intense series of territorial conflicts and struggles taking place here in the global south. Bringing these together, I think, would be extremely important. And the other issue goes back to the conceptual foundations that we've been talking about, these ecological dialectics. You've done an outstanding job of clarifying and explaining how the influence of neo-Kantianism in Western Marxism, the consolidation of this of sort of the Stalinist dogma in the Soviet Union effectively buried the dialectics of nature in both these currents of Marxism, and the need to reconstruct this. I was wondering to what extent this also ties to sort of the, I don't want to say material, but well, yeah, some of the material or historical circumstances involved, such as obviously the Soviet Union following the October Revolution faced a huge need to boost productivity, to address the satisfaction of basic needs, but then found itself in a Cold War with the United States after World War II, and need to constantly escalate production, and this idea of outgrowing capitalism on the one hand, while on the other hand, in the Western capitalist countries, in the capitalist core, we have the emergence of this ideology of growth, the sort of consolidation of growth as the key problem, and as Henri Lefebvre said, the state taking responsibility for assuring the continuance of growth, because as monopoly finance capital started to stagnate, growth became the key issue. To what extent are these tied to this burying of the dialectics of nature, and what implications does this have in terms of the danger posed by these ideologies or these theses of accelerationism and ecological modernization that have been promoted in some cases under the banner of a sort of Promethean Marxism, which is precisely what almost it's complete negation or rejection of ecological Marxism. And so what is the importance of, and how do we respond to these?
Well, one thing I was thinking of when you first started talking was that in my introduction and also in responding to Elizabeth, I don't think I mentioned the metabolic rift at all, which is what a lot of my work has been associated with. And of course, Marx had this theory of ecological crisis that ran quite deep and is quite pervasive throughout his later works, especially, in which he had a notion of the universal metabolism of nature, which corresponds to our modern scientific view. And he saw all nature had this metabolic relation, which essentially defined it actively. And the human beings were part of the universal metabolism of nature through society, through production. That is, the human beings had a specific social metabolism with nature, which was the labor and production process as it developed in history in different forms. And under capitalism, the tendency was for the social metabolism of nature to come increasingly in conflict with the universal metabolism of nature. That is, through extreme robbery of nature, expropriation, the disregard of natural limits. What we created was ecological crises or metabolic rifts in the metabolism between humanity and nature, which then can be understood as a systematic problem resulting primarily from capitalist accumulation and its alienation of the environment. So all of this, when Brian mentioned the metabolic rift and the universal metabolism of nature, all of this is involved. When we look at the solutions like ecological civilization and degrowth, what we're calling planned degrowth, because degrowth is meaningless unless it's planned, which means it has to be socialist. But these different ecological approaches really addressing sustainable human development, but from different circumstances. In the advanced capitalist countries, the problem is to reduce the waste and exorbitant destruction of the environment and to move back to genuine use values and dealing with people's needs and redistribution and collective processes. But it require a reduction of our ecological footprints. We don't need $1 trillion military. Certainly that's destructive of the planet as well as human society. So planned degrowth makes sense in that context. But in the global South, of course, they need, in many countries, in most countries, you need growth, significant amounts of growth, but you want to do it in accordance with sustainable human development, not the path that we followed previously. And so ecological civilization is a meaningful way to address that problem. And both of them, as Brian said, involve delinking from the global value system of capital, not delinking from world economy or world production as a whole, not being autarkic economies, but rather an attempt to delink from the imperialist structure of the world system with the global value system that is governed by, determined, and benefits primarily the global north and prevents fundamental change in the global south, moving from disarticulated economies to autocentric or self-oriented economies. That's what's necessary. And any real advance in the direction of sustainable human development requires delinking. The great theorist of delinking, and of course thus the great theorist of multipolarity was Samir Amin. And we have to really understand the nature of his analysis, his delinking approach to breaking with imperialism. We have to understand that in a more thoroughgoing way if we want to recognize the challenges that are going on. There is a movement in the left to reject the concept of imperialism and to actually attack the anti-imperialist left, and this goes along with attacking the notion of multipolarity. But obviously, that there has to be an opposition to the imperial core of the system, to the global system of value, to multinational corporations in the global south and really everywhere. And this requires delinking from the system in order to create different possibilities. A lot of this occurs in ways that we would not prefer. I was reading Losurdo's Western Marxism the other day, and he was quoting Lenin and saying that anybody who believes that, in pure revolution doesn't understand what revolution is about, that there are going to be all sorts of contradictions when delinking occurs. But the point is that we have to move away from this centralized system in order to create possibilities for people around the world. So delinking is very closely related to these ecological projects. In terms of your question about exterminism, maybe I can just put it fairly short, is that the historic, for a long time, socialists have had the slogan socialism or barbarism, which basically came from Rosa Luxemburg, although it was derived to some extent from Marx and Engels. But Marx actually, in the context of the devastation of Ireland in the 19th century, talked about ruin or revolution. And I actually think that the slogan for our times is not so much socialism or barbarism, but socialism or exterminism. Of course, exterminism encompasses barbarism in a way, but the point is that the whole system is pointing towards exterminism. That makes barbarism more likely, but it also, the point is, we are on the road to the destruction of the planet as a home for humanity. That is, we have a world habitability crisis. We're also destroying species at record rates. The planetary ecological crisis is one of exterminism at the present time. I mean, that's how we can understand it. We also, have the problem of nuclear. There's new dangers of nuclear war and a nuclear arms race being developed, with the United States as the main instigator. The environmental movement really began in the 1950s, when scientists started revolting against the above ground nuclear tests, and the whole environmental movement grew out of that movement. Like Rachel Carson came out of that movement, but and what they were protesting against was the threat of exterminism, and exterminism in that sense is back. And it's more dangerous than ever before. We know that if there is a global thermonuclear war, it's according to the nuclear winter theory. Well, it's now really established within science. It would mean the destruction of all but a few individuals in humanity. It would be the destruction of humanity almost in its entirety in every region of the earth. And we're headed that way. And this is partly a crisis of imperialism. And meanwhile, we're headed towards the destruction of the planet environmentally. I have friends, even my son sometimes he says, well, it's impossible to stop this. But I believe in Sartre's impossible revolutions. I think we have struggles all over the world emerging to combat this. There's a re-emerging environmental proletariat. Whether we will win, succeed, whether we will save humanity, we don't know. But what we do know is that the struggle is here, and we have to join it. So that's in terms of the third question, the neo-Kantianism really pervades Western Marxism, which is basically the notion that neo-Kantianism was developed by Friedrich Lange against materialism and against Marxism. And it was, the notion is we can't know the thing in itself, the Kantian thing in itself, the noumena. And so a materialist approach to the world doesn't make sense. You can't really know nature epistemologically, and the whole notion of a materialist ontology is thrown out, and as well as an epistemology becomes, essentially idealist because it rejects, within philosophy at least, science. The dialectic then only applies to the subject-object relation where you have the identical subject-object, and you can't apply the dialectic where human beings don't exist, which means we can't dialectically analyze the world before human beings existed, and we can't dialectically analyze nature, extra-human nature in any way. And all of this, I think, is tended to separate Marxism from science and to make ecology impossible within Western Marxism. So people like Perry Anderson could say, well, Marxism never had anything to say about ecology. But he did that. What he was saying is Western Marxism didn't have anything to say about ecology. Non-Western Marxism had plenty to say, and Western Marxism became his only universe. But rather than that being a condemnation of Western Marxism, he saw it as something of a virtue that it excluded nature and ecology and science, so it could just be a pure philosophy or a social science. But then it's inadequate for our present world. Getting back to the exterminism issue just for a second, I think it's amazing that notion of settler colonialism was raised by Marx, and the concept was developed in Marxist circles. People like Paul Baran and Uguri Emanuel dealt with white settler colonialism, and but it was always in the context of imperialism theory. Sometimes settler colonialism is dealt with as an abstraction now outside of imperialism theory. So we see Israel as a settler colonial state, which it is, but we forget the whole relation of that, the structure of imperialism, which is really important. And then you can't, and then the United States is supposed to support Israel simply because the United States was a white settler colonial country and recognizes Israel as a similar one. Well, that's partly true, but you have to have the larger analysis of imperialism to really put it all together. But I do think it's interesting that settler colonialism has come back, because settler colonialism is, by definition, as Marx recognized in Capital, in the section on so-called primitive accumulation, it's a form of genocide. It's he talked about the extermination of the population, and it's a form of exterminism, and maybe one of the most extreme forms of exterminism, and it is coming back in our time. And I think it resonates with the entire age in which we live, which we have to fight against as a totality, not in terms of this fragment here or there.
Thank you so much, Brian and John. So we'll move now finally to Gabriel's response. Gabriel Rockhill is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, professor of philosophy, and associate director of the Cultural Studies program at Villanova University, and a research associate at the EHSS, the School for Advanced Studies in Social Science in Paris. He has published 10 books, including most recently Requiem for French Theory with Amérique Monville. And he is currently completing Who Paid the Piper of Western Marxism, the first volume in the Intellectual World War, which is a trilogy of books Gabriel is authoring for Monthly Review Press. He is co-editor of the World Marxist Review and co-editor of the Anti-Imperialist Marxism book series. And his more public-facing writings can be found in venues like Monthly Review, LA Review of Books, New York Times, and Counterpunch. Gabriel?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, John, for writing this book, and Brian Elizabeth for participating in this. I want to say first and foremost that this is an excellent work, and I hope that everyone reads it. It carries with it John's kind of signature erudition, clarity, sense of political and ecological urgency. It is highly readable and yet stocked full of details. So you can follow out the footnotes and find an enormous body of research that John has worked through in order to share with all of us, I think, a fundamental intervention as well as a major contribution to 21st century Marxism, and precisely to the project of reconstruction that he laid out in his opening comments. For my comments today, I basically have kind of three clusters of them on Western Marxism, the ecological proletariat, which will echo some of Brian's concerns, and then the question of the laws of the dialectics of nature. So Western Marxism really frames the entire project, at least as I read it, because it opens it up and presents the kind of project of reconstruction that you highlighted. And the principal problem that you point out is that Western Marxism forecloses the possibility of a meaningful analysis of nature society because it rejects the materialist conception of nature and the dialectics of nature. It thereby leaves us bereft of the theoretical and practical tools necessary to understand the dialectical relationship between nature and society, and crucially, to be able to practically reconfigure it. This ultimately means that at a certain level, Western Marxism, I take it, is ideologically complicit with the capitalist-driven ecocide. Now, against this, of course, you argue for a unified Marxist approach, which was clearly operative in Marx and Engels, as you demonstrate, as well as the best elements of the Marxist tradition. My first question around this issue is, why exactly did Western Marxism sever the Marxist analysis of nature from the social world? Was this primarily an intellectual mistake that it made, or was there a deeper reason for this ideological orientation? As you know, because you just referenced it yourself, MR recently published Western Marxism by Lisordo, and one of the arguments that Lisordo makes against the Trotskyist account of Western Marxism that you find in Perry Anderson is that Western Marxism needs to be understood in terms of the division that Lenin highlighted in the early 20th century between those Marxists who followed the social chauvinism of the labor aristocracy in the imperialist core, and those Marxists who instead supported the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist revolutions in the East. In that regard, Lisordo, and I take it that you do as well, identifies with this anti-imperialist Marxism, which is just another term really for Marxism proper, or universal Marxism. Marxism as a science and a practice of universal human liberation. What this means, if we take Lisordo's position on this, is that Western Marxism emerged historically as a social chauvinist version of Marxism within the imperial core, and it is therefore in part an ideological product of imperialism. In that regard, and I would relate this as well because it overlaps with my own work, I'm concerned with the kind of political economy of knowledge production and the fact that the Western Marxists not only are a consequence of the kind of labor aristocracy writ large, but more specifically, the intellectual labor aristocracy, meaning the academics in the imperial core who are perched at the very top of both economic and symbolic pyramids, and they have the most privileged conditions of intellectual work in the world. And moreover, they have been very explicitly and very directly supported by the capitalist ruling class through their foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, etc., as well as by the bourgeois state. In this regard, is the Western Marxist rejection of a dialectical materialist conception of nature in part due to it being a product of imperial social relations and imperial hubris, rather than a Marxism of the collective struggle of the most exploited and oppressed, as well as those most exposed to the ravages of ecological destruction. We're dealing with academics who are part of the intellectual labor aristocracy that are actually perhaps some of the workers who are the most isolated from the eco side. To adapt a metaphor from Brecht, are these Marxists, the Western Marxists, isolated from real practical struggles, at least to some extent, and definitely to a great extent compared to those in the global South? Are they ultimately writing beautiful phrases on a sinking ship? My second kind of question is about the ecological proletariat. And it's interesting because in your opening comments, you referred to the ecological proletariat more in terms of what they want. But when I was reading the book, at least in certain passages, I had the sense that the environmental proletariat is defined first and foremost by what they do not have, meaning that they are dispossessed, they're deprived of a healthy living environment. And my question around this, I'll be relatively quick because Brian already touched on this a bit, is how can we take your theorization of the environmental proletariat and make it into what Marx referred to as a theory that really grips the masses and takes on true power? Where can we see in the world movements, developments of an environmental proletariat that is not just a kind of descriptive element, but actually becomes a rallying point, what we might call, instead of just a class in itself, a class for itself? One of the examples that came to mind in reading you is the kind of anti-colonial rejuvenation that is occurring across the larger Sahel region in Africa, where you have regions of the world that have been subjected to some of the worst forms of capitalist-driven climate change, particularly through obviously temperatures, desertification, lack of rainfall, and other such things. And that part of these movements are about rejecting the imperialist model of development that has exacerbated the ecological problems. And so would this be an example of a kind of movement driven by perhaps, even slightly unconsciously or subconsciously an environmental proletariat? Or are there other examples that you would point to that clearly articulate the environmental proletariat in its most practical, militant, transformative, and revolutionary aspect, right? Because I think a final word that I'll say on this is, of course, for Marxists, it's the material relations that condition the possibility of social transformation. And one of the things that's so important about your work is you're demonstrating that these material relations are not only economic, they are part of the natural world. They're part of the metabolism that human beings are now subjected to in a very specific way because of the history of capitalism. And in that regard, with the changes, the material changes in the environment, is there an enormous potential for tapping into that as a possibility for deeper revolutionary transformation? And then if so, because of course your argument is that that's the case, how exactly does this play itself out in concrete struggles? My third kind of comments and questions have to do with the dialectics of nature. I think one of the most important things that you've done, not only in this book, but in your earlier work and a lot of your co-authored work as well, is that you have been invested in this project of restructuring the kind of entire Marxist project as encompassing not just the social world, but also the natural world, not just historical materialism, but also dialectical materialism. And I'm fully on board with this project and consider it to be one of the single most important things for contemporary class struggle in theory. In that regard, the debate around Engels, and particularly the later work by Engels, is at the forefront of the conversations concerning Marxism's relationship to nature and dialectics. And one of the concerns that I have is that it does strike me that there are fundamental aspects of Engels' contribution that are absolutely undeniable, insofar as dialectics is understood as an apprehension of the world that recognizes that everything is in process. Everything is part of temporality and history. There's nothing outside of that. Secondly, everything is relational. There's no kind of border that exists somewhere in the world that would create isolated phenomenon. And thirdly, that everything is interconnected in a totality. All three of those aspects seem absolutely coherent and essential to maintaining in the dialectics of nature. One of the elements that I'm going to raise a question about is, and it's interesting that in the book you put the term in quotes, is Engels' references to laws of nature. One of the risks or limitations that I see in some of Engels' later writings is that he makes a distinction between, of course, dialectics and metaphysics. And a metaphysical approach assumes that there are fixed and reified elements of reality. So it rejects this idea of a process-based, interrelated, and interconnected totality. The idea of a law is complicated in that regard because there's the risk of reifying a law and making it into something like a metaphysical absolute or a fixed element that would capture the totality of processes and reduce them to a reified norm. Within Engels' later writings, one of the statements that he makes is quite remarkable. He says, quote, "A system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything and final for all time, is a contradiction to the fundamental laws of dialectic reasoning," right? So how exactly should we understand laws in this regard? And is there the risk of trying to use the three laws outlined by Engels, the transformation of quantity into quality, the unity identity of opposites, and the negation of the negation? Is there the risk of using them in a metaphysical sense instead of in a dialectical sense? And if so, part of the reason for asking this question is that I'm more prone to be oriented towards the dialectical rather than the risks of reifying them and trying to kind of shoehorn the totality of the natural world into fixed laws. In part because, and here I'll reference The Destruction of Reason by Lukács, and in particular, his analysis of dialectics within that book, as well as Lenin's description of dialectics as many-sided knowledge that is constantly opening itself up and constantly trying to advance in order to account for the fact that the objective world or the external world surpasses the subjective categories of analysis that we have. If we take Lukács's point about dialectics, that ultimately it's an attempt to open up our categories of analysis to a complex, intricate world in process that inevitably surpasses it, then do we not need to understand these laws as almost limited heuristics that might work in certain sectors of the natural world, might be very helpful for elucidating certain things, but certainly do not encompass the totality of nature or the totality of the objective world, insofar as that totality is always articulated via a process of an ongoing process by which subjects attempt to apprehend it. And the scientific approach to natural reality, if we take a kind of agential realist orientation, is such that there are phenomena, certainly, that we know nothing about thus far, that we cannot apprehend because we do not have the tools to apprehend them, the conceptual vocabulary, etc. And so I'm curious if we need to understand these laws of the dialectics of nature and Engels more in this dialectical, open-ended, more subtle approach than in the risks of a kind of metaphysical reification, if you will. I'll leave my comments at that, and I guess say finally that the book is an enormous contribution, and I look forward to reading the next installment, which is the intervention around Epicurus, because I think it will also then further flesh out the absolute importance of seeing the kind of unity of the Marxist project as encompassing not only an analysis of the social world, but also of the natural world and the ontology of materialism. So, John or Jennifer, I'll turn it back over to you.
Go ahead, John.
Well, your opening statement on the book, I think, was such a great summary. I wish I'd said what you said in the beginning. It's very, very succinct and strong. In terms of the questions that why did Western Marxism, Western Marxist philosophical tradition, why did it go the direction it went in a neo-Kantian direction? Why did it reject materialism and dialectics? How was this related to imperialism? That's the why question is very difficult to answer. But I think that there was, in some ways, the initiative was taken by what we could call bourgeois philosophy with the development of neo-Kantianism itself. And so a Western Marxist tradition, as philosophers, they were sort of weaned on neo-Kantianism from the very beginning, and they tended to look at it that way and to see being a philosopher almost meant having that kind of dualistic conception, and it's quite complex. So it's not easy to answer the question why. I mean, we could look back to Friedrich Lange, who definitely developed neo-Kantianism as a way of attacking materialism. And we can see how the neo-Kantianism developed from that, and how, I mean, Lukács was originally in part of the neo-Kantian tradition, and all these other thinkers basically held on to that. And almost as a proof that they were philosophers. But that has to do with the hegemony of bourgeois ideology. But there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, I think it really goes back to some of the things you talk about. One of the things is the revolution didn't take place in the West, or it wasn't successful. The revolution, of course, there was the Russian Revolution, and that created a different trajectory. But in the West, the revolutions were, that to the extent that they took place, they were defeated, and the working class was to some extent incorporated in the system. Some of it, let's say, as Lenin would say, the upper stratum, and the Western Marxists, they were enamored with some aspects of Marxism, but they ended up jettisoning materialism. The materialism was seen as non-philosophical, anti-philosophical, reductionist. They bought into that neo-Kantian terms. As part of that, in part of rejecting the dialectical materialism in the East, they rejected any dialectics of nature, because that would mean that they had to address materialism, and they had to address nature as part of the dialectic, and that would have put them in philosophical opposition to the entire Western philosophical tradition, which they didn't really want to do. But they also rejected in their analysis, they abandoned class struggle for the most part in their analysis. They abandoned the notion of imperialism, and of course, there's a great deal of social chauvinism. We could say with Lenin that if we think of as the imperialist stage of capitalism, well, then they were rejecting everything that Lenin had to say with respect to imperialism. They rejected the notion of monopoly capitalism, and they rejected the Marxist theory of ideology, which saw it as class situated. So and bought into the sociology of knowledge of Mannheim and so on. So almost all the fundamental, even though there is a great deal that you can do with dialectics and with Marxian categories, Western Marxism, for the most part, especially those who are involved in the philosophical aspects, abandon the core Marxism. This doesn't apply to Gramsci, it doesn't apply to Lukács, and it doesn't apply to those who were political economists. But Anderson, when he wrote his contribution to Western Marxism, he defined all of those outside of Western Marxism, right? The economists were removed. Lukács, or later Lukács, was no longer part of Western Marxism, and of course, Gramsci only has a kind of partial presence that downplays his actual political praxis. So I don't know how to explain it, except that Lukács called, referring to Adorno and so on, who was invited back into the occupied Germany by the U.S. occupying forces and wrote for U.S. Army founded publication run by the CIA, essentially, or funded by the CIA, and attacked Lukács. And Lukács responded, "This is the grand hotel abyss. This is Marxism to some extent doing the work of bourgeois philosophy." It's very hard to explain. I wouldn't disown Western Marxism entirely. I learned too much from it. It's too important. There are thinkers who came out of it who were more radical, but the dominant tradition, I think Lukács understood what was happening, and that this was Marxism of the chair, Marxism that was demarxified, or you can't count the number of times that they quote Marx. Engels said, well, Marx said once in response to the French Marxists who were kind of reductionist, deterministic, he said, "I'm not a Marxist," which is a common thing for somebody to say if somebody makes their name into a movement. And but that's quoted all the time. Marx said he wasn't a Marxist. He has nothing to do with Marxism, and this is now really ensconced in the academy, and Western Marxism played a big role in that. So how do you explain it? I think that the truth is that they abandoned any conception of revolution, even the possibility of revolution. There were people, Sartre, although he was a Western Marxist in the sense of rejecting the dialectics of nature, he never really rejected revolution. And look at Horkheimer, right? He turns absolutely reactionary. So this is a real problem, and the Western Marxism's basically fragmentation of Marxism opened up the way to post-Marxist and post-modernist and post-structuralist analysis, which treated the whole analysis as a plaything, right? And easily turned supposedly in our reactionary direction. So that is a major problem. I would say, yeah, the rejection of imperialism is at the core, because if you're, and as Paul Sweezy argued in the 1960s, that if you're a Marxist, you identify with the revolutions that are going on in the world, and those were all in the global South. It's those who identified with revolutions in the global South who retained a genuine Marxist perspective, and those who didn't, basically, they took the legacy and they melted it down and used it in various ways that promoted their own careers. In terms of the other question, on environmental proletarian, the environmental proletariat. It's complicated. I think that the environmental proletariat is the revolutionary proletariat, although I haven't ever said that quite. But if you go back to Engels as the condition of the working class, he was writing at a time after the plot riots and the what they called them, the revolt, the early Chartist revolts, and he'd come in right after that and wrote the condition of the working class and in England, and his analysis is not about workers primarily in factories. There's that there. It's there. He's not just talking about exploitation of workers or the reserve army, a term that he introduced, or anything that, it's not just looking at production in the narrow sense. It's looking at the working class as living in its life in a lived environment, in a material environment, in terms of communities. In that sense, it's not that far from what E.P. Thompson was doing with his making of the English working class. But Engels was looking at the housing of the workers, the fact that they were living in cellars, and water was leaking into them, the fact that they were drinking, polluted water and getting cholera. He was looking at all the diseases. He was looking at the comparative lifespans, the mortality rates in the working class versus the middle class or capitalist areas, and showing how much that the infant mortality was 50% in some working class areas. So he's looking at all of these problems. He was looking at disability caused by the production system. It was all environmental, and this was not some sort of weird thing on his part, because the working class at the time was in revolt against all of those conditions, which were brought on by capitalism and the capitalist production system. But it wasn't just about wages. Or Max Weber said, well, the working class only struggles over wages. This is nonsense. The more revolutionary the working class is, the more it's concerned with the entire environment and the entire social condition in which it's placed. And you will find that, I think, and this is sort of in the back of my mind, that all of the revolutions have been revolutions of what we could say an environmental proletariat that is bringing, they're concerned with land and not just wages, right? They're concerned with production, so that, and and we see this today throughout the global South, too narrow a conception of the proletariat as simply like a white male blue collar workers or just production workers. And this was inserted into Marxism. This was not the conception that Marx and Engels had. If you look at the Holy Family, when they define the proletariat, they define them in exactly the terms that you said, Gabriel. They define the proletariat as primarily the dispossessed. And that is really the crucial starting point. So it has to be looked at like that. If you see the working class in terms of let's say the advanced capitalist society of today, and that kind of picture of the working class, you've already lost any conception of the revolutionary working class or any conception of real change. And if you look at the environmental proletariat, you look at these wider conditions, then you understand the relationship between the working class in the advanced capitalist states at its lower levels, right? The most oppressed, and that of third world workers. Lenin, Lenin had this notion of the labor aristocracy, of course, and he said, look, the upper stratum of the working class gets bought off in the advanced capitalist and the imperialist states to a considerable extent. And we have all sorts of manifestations of that. But, that's sort of a negative view of what he was saying. What he actually said, he took that a step further, and he said, that means we have to go deeper. It means we have to go into the deeper levels of oppression. That's our job. And I think that that is just fundamental. In terms of your third question, the dialectics of nature and Engels, the restructuring of Marx's project, but you were talking about the three laws of dialectics. I mean, Engels used the term laws. It didn't at that time. Laws was used fairly loosely. Now it's been kind of reified into a narrow spectrum of what is a scientific law, and but they used law, the notion of law, and if you think of coming out of Francis Bacon and up into the 19th century, they used the term law fairly broadly to refer to fundamental regularities, right? And but the thing is that what Engels was calling the three laws of dialectics, and I don't think we have to be obsessive about the term law, is he was talking about what we call ontological principles, what we would today in philosophy, what we call ontological principles. So, and these are ontological principles or guidelines for analysis. It wasn't meant to encompass totality, in all of totality or some. These are ontological principles with which you look at the dynamics of the natural world and the world as a whole. And it was modeled after Hegel's reflection determinations in his doctrine of essence and in the logic. And Engels, talked about three ontological principles. Now, most in Western Marxism, when you talk about dialectics, it's almost all just the second law or the second ontological principle, that is, the identity of opposites, or however you want to say it. If you look at Bertel Ollmann's work and the way in which dialectics is commonly used in the academy today, it's almost all just identity of opposites. And that's the least, I mean, that's an essential part of the analysis and breaking down dualism, but in some ways it's the least critical element of these three ontological principles. The first one is that quantitative development can lead to, or quantitative change can lead to qualitative change, or vice versa. Or vice versa is always forgotten. So qualitative change can lead to quantitative change. That's what, for example, if you wanted to use the qualitative change can lead to quantitative change. If we had a planned, a socialist system, or we had a planned degrowth, let's say, we could, if we adopt a socialist model, we can actually accomplish. That's a qualitative change. That means the quantitative parameters are altered. So we need to keep on expanding the system in order to improve people's lives. The qualitative transformation can actually change what is quantitatively necessarily, even reduce it. So anyway, that's the first ontological principle, the quantitative change leading to qualitative transformation. That's called a phase change in science. It's recognized in science. In fact, I think it was Hyman Levy, the British Marxist mathematician who really pushed that first in his systems theory. We have other terms for it, but it's known as phase change, and it really points to emergence, right? So, which is fundamentalist to the materialist view, so that we know, like, if you combine atoms or molecules, just starting there, you get something qualitatively new, right? And Marx and Engels always emphasized that in Marx's chapter on cooperation, he says, look, cooperation creates something qualitatively new, in emergence of a qualitatively new form of labor. And that kind of thinking was crucial, and it's now used all the time in science, and it's integrated with the concept of emergence. Then you have the identity of opposites, essentially, or the non-identity, or the identity of identity and non-identity, or whatever version you want to do of it. But that breaks down all kinds of dualisms and reductionisms. But by itself doesn't say anything about dynamics of the system. But it's crucial in terms of getting past all those metaphysical categories that you talked about. Then the third ontological principle, the negation of the negation, which Marx uses in Capital at the very key point of Capital when he's talking about the expropriation of the expropriators. That is the climax of Capital, which he calls the negation of the negation, because Capital expropriated the working class by enclosure of the commons, and the answer is to expropriate capital and create entirely a different collective social system. And but the negation of the negation is really kind of taking emergence to a whole different level. You can see, that we think of it in terms of historical residuals combining with the present in order to create new possibilities that negate the present and generate a new future that is partly the product of the past, of a past that was denied or abandoned. this negation of the negation is absolutely crucial. It's sort of a definition of a whole revolutionary way of thinking. So these are ontological principles, and they're fundamental. To throw them away would be a problem, but usually they're attacked as though Engels meant some kind of really rigid reductionist, had some rigid reductionist notion, which is completely false. But then, Adorno starts off his negative dialectics by saying the whole purpose of the book is to eliminate the notion of the negation of the negation, the notion that there is a positive element in the dialectic. That is the notion that there is a positive revolutionary development. That is the question. He eliminates that question. That's the whole purpose of his negative dialectics, which is celebrated as one of the greatest works of dialectics, but actually is in many ways it's the negation of dialectics. It's the negation of Hegel's dialectics and the negation of Marx's dialectics. I suppose Adorno, with his ending of the negation, it's his own way of saying that history has ended, which has permeated Western Marxism and the Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, and you know all that better than me. Anyway, I'm doing my best to answer your question, but it's a big one, and I think I better stop.
Thank you so much. This was it was a wonderful response. Since we're already at the hour, I don't want to go more than 2 hours. I think we're just going to wrap this up here. I'm so grateful, John, for these detailed and incredibly generous responses. And thank you so much to Brian, Elizabeth, and Gabriel for your responses and your questions. Again, you can buy the Dialectics of Ecology, Socialism and Nature from Monthly Review, and we, of course, really encourage you to do so. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Could I just say that it's too bad we didn't get to the questions, but if anybody wants to email me a question, I'll do my best to answer it.
Thank you for offering that. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Unless, Gabriel, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for contributing, John, for writing the book in the first place, but then all of your generous and very rich responses. It's been a wonderful conversation, so thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
For the invitation to participate.
Of course.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Elizabeth, Brian, Gabriel, Jennifer. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
I'll be in touch on Monday. I have more to say. I'll see you soon.
Okay, good.
Bye.
I'd love that. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.